Hey there, guys! Today we have a new story for you. Well, this story is quite different from the usual ones I bring here, as I don't typically feature tales where our boy literally transforms into a dragon. But in this one, he transforms into a dragon, and as a dragon, he can wreak havoc on any monster, including other dragons. Since this is the first story and the first video of the year, we can continue with our narrative. Something refers to a dragon saying it was impressive for him to have made it here, to have reached the final destination. Now that he has overcome death, they congratulate our protagonist for reaching the top of the tower. However, now that he's here, the dragon asks him to show his true power, the power to kill a dragon. Hearing this, he finds it perfect. It was truly perfect, because he was basically being seen as the final boss. For him, this was a great challenge, as the kid loved tough challenges. At the moment he says he's ready to face the dragon activates one of its spells. In that instant, our hero jumps straight at the dragon, but the dragon then uses its magic against our hero. Meanwhile, in the general chat, some were saying this was the ultimate boss of the crazy challenge that had appeared in the world, but they already knew who this madman was. At this moment, our protagonist jumped and was now face to face with the dragon. As he was about to strike the dragon, he draws his sword and waits for the dragon's move. But after making this move, we notice something happening. His eyes begin to emanate an aura, and after that, his hand starts transforming into a dragon's claw. He then charges toward the other dragon in front of him. Following this, he launches a single slash. That one slash was enough to pierce through it. After the entire scene, the powerful dragon realized that maybe what he used was the power of the Chaos Dragon. This was the strongest ability, but even then, he knew that using the dragon's power to defeat a dragon would be unfair. Thus, he decides to fight it with his sword, since his goal is to cut it over 1 trillion times. The dragon found this intriguing and was eager to see how far he could go. At this point, the fight begins to unfold. On one side, some weak monsters appeared. Facing them, he used his dimensional slashes, which easily cut them down one by one. He noticed more appeared, but at that moment, his focus wasn't to defeat these weak monsters. It was on taking down the stronger boss. Telling the weaklings to scram, what he wanted happened. The small creatures disappeared. After they vanished, the watch on his wrist indicated he had 5 seconds to dodge the dragon's breath. At that moment, the clock began counting down from 5 to 3. He started dodging, and minutes later, as we reached one, we saw a dragon's breath attack coming straight toward the top of the building. Power almost struck our hero, but he managed to dodge at the last moment. Saved now, he realized that if he hadn't evaded that blow, he would be dead. Meanwhile, in the general chat, people assumed that our protagonist had already been defeated since hours and hours had passed, and the kid still hadn't shown up with the dragon's head or its coconut. And so the fight unfolded, reaching a point where both were extremely wounded. The dragon thought that humans, in the end, were truly incredible, seeing that they didn't give up. But the dragon was injured and didn't want to continue the fight since he was still young and wanted to live his lives, especially in the nightlife. So he wanted to withdraw, but our hero asked him to return, as he had prepared his whole life for this moment. Meanwhile, the dragon disappeared, and the system then showed that he had managed to repel the dragon, earning a new title, but he didn't care about that. He thought it was all a joke. Throwing his gear to the ground, we then saw our protagonist disheartened because his stream, which he had been broadcasting, was basically a complete disaster. His audience began mocking him, but there was something worse. Because this had happened to him, he ended up losing everything, as the game he was playing was one of the most famous in his world. This game essentially provided him with a near-royal lifestyle. The sadness didn't stop there, though, as something tragic happened in his life. His sister ended up contracting an illness, and he couldn't find a cure for her. Time passed, and 2 years later, we saw him working in a supermarket, being humiliated by an old man in front of him, calling him useless for working there. After taking all of that, he asked at least for the man to move on, buy what he wanted, and leave. After that, he walked out the door. Later that afternoon, we saw him kicking a door in frustration, saying, What a horrible day this has been. At that moment, he sat down and realized that if the game hadn't ended, he wouldn't be in this situation. Back then, he was one of the best in the world. But now he stood up, realizing he was an adult and couldn't act the same way he had before. Just then, he heard a voice saying that he would be destroyed in the way he had desired. At that moment, he was startled because, looking ahead, he saw a scale and something resembling what he had seen before. As soon as he noticed it, he began running toward the street, where he found some people looking up. When he looked in that direction, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Before him was the Dragon Emperor, the one he had almost defeated in that game. To make matters worse, several monsters that had existed in the game also appeared in real life. One of those monsters came toward him, while another was almost stopped by some police officers. But to no avail. At that moment, he thought he might be dreaming, but it wasn't quite that. One of the monsters appeared in front of him, almost biting him. He was about to be caught when he looked back and found a bat. Grabbing it, he turned to face one of the monsters which tried to bite him. To avoid being bitten, he raised the bat and struck the monster square in the face, sending it flying backward. After defeating it, he realized that common ones work on monsters like this, but now, if it's basically IG, the game means he has a pretty high chance of defeating this monster since its weak point is its jaw. If this is real, basically this game is his home, and he will manage to become the strongest and fastest possible in this way. But as soon as he thought about doing something, one of the monsters started running. Well, he then realized that that monster over there, ran and ended up escaping, making his life hell. Well, he even thought about chasing after this monster, but he decided to leave it for later because he took a motorcycle and moved forward in another direction, saying that moving further ahead, he could get some much better items, which would make him much stronger. The place where the better items were was the dragon. But where would he find this dragon? It's easy. Just look at the tallest tower where it was coiled at the top. So he ended up grabbing the motorcycle and speeding up a little more ahead. But he was surprised to find one of the monsters in front of him. He stopped the motorcycle in an epic way, letting it go and then jumping off, leaving the motorcycle to crash head-on into one of the monsters. After that, he jumped on top of one of the monsters, which was hit by the motorcycle. However, the motorcycle was destroyed, and he didn't like that. So, in return, he wanted something from this monster, its XP. Thus, he grabbed the bat and hit it, killing it. At first, he even joked that it would give XP until he actually saw the monster was giving XP. A sphere appeared above the monster he had just defeated. Surprised, he approached and grabbed it. Upon doing so, he realized that in the game, he would eat it. So he ate it, and as soon as he did, he noticed his level increased. He looked at the palm of his hand and noticed the level had been reached. Having achieved this, he was happy, but the monsters behind him were not. One of the monsters then ran toward our hero to grab him, but it was useless because with one arm, he easily lifted that monster. Another one that wanted to try its luck was easily thrown back with just a kick. After all that, we see him excited because he realized things were getting interesting now. These monsters gave him experience, and the experience made him much stronger. So, he kills the monsters in the area, reaching 5 levels. After all this, we see him excited, but he got too excited for having killed all those monsters. The bat he now held in his hand was completely destroyed. However, he wondered and realized that he basically needed a way to get stronger, just like in the game. He looked at a fang from the monster that fell to the ground. With what fell, he picked it up and realized he could use it to his advantage. Next, we see him placing it on his bat, transforming that harmless bat into something dangerous. But if it's like in the game, these guys are weak to weapons with material effects. For this, he would need to find some demi-humans. Maybe he could still get much more powerful weapons. As he thought about what he needed to do to get stronger, he heard a girl's voice asking for help. However, the plea was kind of ignored. She kept asking for help, but at this moment, our protagonist turned around. He didn't see the girl, but rather that this girl was basically a demi-human. However, realizing she was in danger, he approached the monster. But now that he got closer, he asked it to stop doing these things to the demi-human. Right after doing this, we then see it delivering a blow, our hero, but he dodged easily. However, at that moment, because he managed to dodge. He ended up hitting a body on his leg, causing the monster in front of him to fall to its knees. He then saw an opportunity to land a blow directly on its face. After delivering this powerful strike to its face, he noticed that the monster had many weak points to target, but its real weakness was its back. So, seemingly careless, we see him holding the baton, which he then used to strike the monster's head. Now that he had killed the creature, he acquired an extremely good weapon, allowing him to retreat. The girl who witnessed it all was surprised, but she was even more astonished by the weapon he used. Now he needed to leave, but before retreating, the girl introduced herself as Akui. She was one of the promising newcomers. She then asked who he was, and he introduced himself as Massacre. Upon hearing his name, she pleaded with Massacre to at least help her get out of that situation. He, having heard her plea, simply said no, he did not want to help. As he was about to leave, we observed her declaring that she was one of the very strong supernovas. She demanded to know why he should help her. He then pointed in her direction and said that she was at level 0, and he was looking for someone strong. As he said this, she grabbed his shirt, realizing that our protagonist already understood this game. Even though she was at level 0, he perceived that she was still strong. However, after largely ignoring her, she began to act somewhat differently. Then, out of nowhere, he changed the subject, saying that in the game, he had done many good things to become stronger. Upon mentioning the game, she said that she had also done many things in the game. Well, the things weren't the best in the world, but she had done them. However, now that she stopped to think for a moment, she recognized the face of our protagonist. He was that foolish hunter who had defeated the most powerful boss. Afterward, he became viral on the internet. In the end, they entered the game. They were basically playing, but before he could leave, she asked him to help her become the world champion. He did not. Instead, he handed her that sword and asked her to leave, as his current goal was to face the most powerful boss ahead. After hearing this, she said she also wanted to fight, but he told her to go back. After saying this, she became sad and said he was basically leaving her alone. He then paused to think and remembered his sister. He decided not to leave her alone because this memory struck a good chord in him. Afterward, he allowed her to follow him, but one thing was certain. She had to stay alive, as our protagonist would not keep her alive by himself. On second thought, if he managed to defeat the most powerful boss, she would become famous. Upon hearing this, our protagonist viewed it differently. However, they couldn't stay long talking, as Mike needed to face that boss. So they headed toward the boss. As time passed, they reached the boss's side. At that moment, they realized that many people were in the same place, trying to face the boss. This was bad, but our protagonist thought of a good strategy. She thought of the same, but didn't want to do it. Since it was like a game, he could win against this boss or anything else more easily. Although his current weapons weren't the strongest, they were sufficient. At that moment, she called his name, and he asked her to stay quiet. He just wanted revenge on this dragon for escaping last time. At that moment, looking up, they realized the dragon was looking in their direction. The two clearly noticed this and froze. Moments later, the dragon advanced in their direction, opening its mouth and running toward their group. The dragon opened its mouth, but instead of biting, it roared, causing both to cover their ears from the sound. Above them, the dragon hovered. After this loud noise, we observed the girl beside him calling Mike, saying that in front of him appeared some monsters. These monsters were very dangerous, and to make things worse, they were in very large numbers. They were running towards him, and, for them, clearly, it didn't seem, good for them. So they should stay together for at least a little bit. That's what they did. They stayed together while fighting some of the monsters. But still, things weren't good because the dragon in front of them was moving, and that wasn't good at all. The girl by his side began to feel fear, because these monsters were managing to defeat them and had the advantage. Then they turned to her, asking her to at least hit the horn because the horn was the weakest part of those monsters. But at another point, it made him come. At that moment, upon hearing this, she didn't think twice before aiming at that other part. And well, one monster couldn't stay standing. It ended up falling to the ground. Meanwhile, our protagonist saw that she was doing everything to survive, and then below we could see the dragon appearing. The monster that appeared in front of him froze our protagonist completely after giving that look. The dragon got stuck and wondered what it was looking at with that weird gaze. But last time, it escaped. However, this time, it wouldn't. Then our protagonist grabbed its tail and started climbing up it. After calling for her, asking her to follow him, it didn't help much because she, without any sense, ended up tripping and falling to the ground. However, by falling face first on the ground, she realized it was no use anymore because the dragon was already flying too high with him on top. Now we could observe him holding on to the dragon's tail as tightly as possible. But after being up there for a while, the dragon suddenly began to stop. He was happy about this because now he could finally stand on top of this dragon. But looking to the side, he realized that now the dragon flew high again, and meanwhile he wondered if that girl from earlier would be okay alone on the ground. But he thought twice. Yes, she would be fine. Our protagonist had only one goal: to collect a good material. However, the best material he could find was the dragon scale, which was right there in front of him for him to collect. Also, the dragon scale was the key to him being able to use his powers, something he learned 2 years ago. But as he moved forward, he got a big surprise because ahead, we could see that others had used the same strategy. However, as we could see, everyone had been defeated. But now he wondered who had defeated this group, asking who it was. Suddenly, a praying mantis appeared. At this moment, to avoid being caught, he noticed the presence of this monster. The moment it appeared, it attacked our protagonist. The staff he held in his hand was used to defend himself, but after using it to block the praying mantis, he realized the staff was cut in half. After all this, we saw the surprised face of our hero, but at that moment he couldn't stay still, because the praying mantis prepared to attack again. Well, staying here was very bad, so our protagonist started running in its direction. As he got closer than ever, he grabbed the remaining piece of the staff. At that moment, he crouched down and then thrust the remaining piece of the staff into its chest, believing that its weak spot had to be there. At that moment, the creature kind of died. Even so, after this, he threw the creature to the side. He knew one thing: defeating this monster made him realize these creatures always went after his heart. In the game, it was the same thing. At this moment, as he spoke about it happening in the game, another praying mantis appeared behind him. And guess what? It tried to grab his back, but he managed to predict it and dodged to the side. Now he realized these creatures were indeed sneaky. Even so, now that he stood up, he saw that there were many praying mantises around. Realizing that there were so many in front of him, he understood he couldn't do anything else. So, after realizing this, our protagonist began running in another direction. But the moment he started running, another praying mantis appeared in front of him and launched an attack at our hero. To avoid being caught, he dodged and then landed a kick to its chest, pushing the praying mantis back a bit. His goal wasn't to fight these weak creatures, but to find something special. Again, he ran, and when he finally reached what he desired, his eyes began to shine. Looking ahead, he found it. The sword he had longed for. At that moment, he placed his hand on the hilt of the sword. With one pull upward, our protagonist finally managed to remove the sword that was embedded in this dragon. The one who pulled it noticed that it was removable very easily, but at that moment, when he thought everything was easy, a kind of gigantic tick appeared in front of him. Right at that moment, it hit our protagonist, basically filling a C, which then threw him back a little, falling somewhere unknown. He realized that these monsters were exactly the same as last time, but now he had let his guard down. Kaino realized his mistake, but it was not entirely the end yet. As he held the dragon sword in his hand, he could use that power, only the dragon's power, so he ended up opting for the same idea after hearing that coming from his arch-enemy. He shouldn't have listened to that voice, but to use its power, he needed to grab the sword and stab it into his chest. Only then could he obtain that power. In this situation, he had no choice, as he needed to get out of this moment. So he opted to go ahead and grab that sword, pointing it at his chest. and there he ended up waiting, but something began to happen. A gigantic pain surged toward him. But it wasn't just that. He was kind of dumb, right? He realized that this wasn't a game. In the game, he could expect not to feel any pain, and there was no chance of dying. Now he realized he couldn't endure this state and ended up fainting, falling onto a building on top of the building. We then observe our protagonist, or rather something transformed into him. That thing that transformed into him got up, but as soon as it stood, the dragon appeared, saying its name. Well, its name was this, but as soon as it said its name, it sent some weak dragons in his direction. But our protagonist, merely observing this, realized that these creatures were there to attack him. However, minutes later, what our hero had transformed into easily destroyed the dragons. This thing he transformed into ended up asking him to resist, but there was one thing that this dragon would accept if, by chance, our hero surrendered it to him. This would be 6 swords or a priest. But while he spoke, that girl there began to climb the building. In the end, she had a surprise when she found our protagonist roaring upwards like an unconscious animal. But the dragon above ended up telling him to rise, otherwise he would basically destroy everything in this city. Someone was calling his name, however, asking him to wake up. He then woke up and asked who it was. As soon as he woke up, she ended up kind of asking herself if he was alive by chance. He said yes, but he didn't remember what had happened. The girl said he had turned into a monster and lost control, but what really happened was that he fought some monsters and defeated them all. And to make matters worse, he began to face several monsters, and with no difficulty, killed them. But the most important thing was where the primordial dragon was. She said the primordial dragon returned to its starting point and ended up transforming into a stone. But after saying such things, she ended up kind of wondering what that thing he held in his hand was. He said it was the Emperor Dragon's scale, and it saved his life. But while saying this, suddenly we observed something falling in front of him. However, after that fell in front of him, we observe, after some smoke appeared, a few people with masks appearing. To our protagonist, this was not good, as they needed to escape from there. However, it was no use. That smoke made them weak. But at that moment, one of the masked figures appeared in front of him and struck a blow, hitting our protagonist. After receiving that blow, he couldn't take it and ended up fainting. After a few minutes, he woke up. But where he found himself was in front of a mirror in a hospital. However, after waking up and looking to the side, he noticed a beautiful girl who kind of asked herself if he had really woken up. But now that he was awake, she said he had been out for a while. But this wasn't important, because now she was about to ask him one single question, and he needed to answer it. She asked if, by chance, he was a spy for the Emperor Dragon. He could say that this question made him angry. But then a bullet went past his side. He was startled by this, and the girl appeared in front of him, saying she wasn't joking either, and asked him to at least answer the question a little sincerely. At that moment, another girl appeared, and we wondered if she couldn't simply interrogate him. However, that girl ended up kind of saying that, well, he hadn't done anything. Mike wasn't a spy for that dragon, since, even in the end, with a look that was a little more than serious, he ends up saying no, that he wasn't that, since he was a dragon slayer in the game. He even had his own name for it, but the girl didn't know it. Then she says that if by any chance he is a dragon slayer, then she would do the same. But after that, she takes a cigarette and starts smoking, and then says that the world was in chaos, and there was a dragon outside, and he was basically a dragon. So she asks him to get rid of that dragon as soon as possible. After all that, she introduces herself as Chuck. She basically presents herself as the commander of Hydra's special operations. After saying this, she begins to state that this game has revealed everything. After some time, we see them in another place. She, on the other hand, was already very hungry. Our hero asks her to hold on a bit since she had eaten many things just a while ago. However, then, the girl from the other side ends up saying that she will deliver him the information about the place where they need to go. But if he has any doubts, he just needs to ask. Blast will basically give him the information he wants. So, he calls for Blast and asks him to show the information about the sword. This sword was the 4th sword, known as the Dragon Slayer. It also had some very good features. allowing one to face a very strong dragon head-on. Now that he had this sword, he looks at the girl beside him and wonders what kind of cat ears those were. But he doesn't care much about it since their goal was now to look for a certain group of people who were basically hunting or targeting newbie players. The girl soon comments that they should be more careful while searching for this, but our protagonist couldn't care less. He calls for Blast and asks him to play a song. As the music starts, they are taken by surprise as, looking back, they see one of the monsters appearing behind them. After it appears, we then see our protagonist using the sword to strike it down, successfully killing the first monster. However, another monster appears, and once again, our protagonist manages to slice it in half. Someone on the other side is surprised by how skilled he is with the sword. Meanwhile, the girl also manages to finish off one of the monsters. After taking down one of the monsters, the protagonist warns her to be careful as another one is still behind her. She hears this and, turning around, is surprised as an arrow flies towards the monster and hits it dead on, knocking it down. Looking back in surprise, they then notice a group of people appearing, essentially saving their skins. This group turned out to be from the same faction as them. He quickly asks for help, and now they have reinforcements to face the monsters more easily since their goal was to finish this quickly. Meanwhile, at her headquarters, we see someone mentioning that other places had people asking for reinforcements, but the girl instructs them to ignore it as their goal is to handle this alone. The fight returns to our protagonist, who takes down one of the monsters with ease. After some time, the fight is concluded, but before they can leave, someone behind the screen asks them to collect at least some resources on the ground. While considering this, we see someone from a distant place aiming at her. However, nothing happens, and they are then seen on a bridge looking down, realizing they should move to another location to continue forward. Our protagonist calls for Basak and asks him to scout the area. Activating the scan, the system indicates there are many explosives in the area, urging caution. At that moment, 3 were planted behind them to explode. Moments later, the explosions occur. To avoid being caught, he tells her to jump, and they both leap off the bridge. Landing on the ground below, they find themselves surrounded by some enemies, but nothing too concerning. Now cornered, they see someone appearing, realizing they weren't hurt. This was unfair, as the traps had been well set. Looking up, he notices that his entire group was defeated. Now faced with 2 options, the antagonist offers to let the girl go in exchange for the protagonist staying behind, or vice versa. After giving these choices, the antagonist urges him to hurry while his men point their weapons at him. After some time, the protagonist responds that he won't leave the girl behind. In exchange, he will let the enemy flee, as it would be better for them to run rather than become test subjects. Since these trash didn't deserve to live, this was their only option. Hearing this, the antagonist becomes furious, smashing a nearby bus in anger. He declares that he had given them good options, but they refused, claiming he was also a level 10 boxer, the strongest in the area. Before anything else could happen, the girl calls for reinforcements, but her request is denied. Frustrated, she becomes extremely angry. Becomes extremely irritated, seeing that the Central Command refused to send reinforcements to help him. On the other hand, she says this happens all the time. Here, the scene shifts back to them. Thus, he ordered his group to attack with several arrows. They then head towards our hero, but with a simple hand movement, he manages to deflect all the arrows to the side. Meanwhile, our protagonist notices that one of those arrows unfortunately hit him, landing on his foot. After the arrow struck his foot, our protagonist simply pulls it out. Then, he says they cannot surprise him with such a simple level 10 attack. Although it's impressive to see someone reach level 10 in real life so easily, since leveling up in real life is hard, what would a dragon hunter fear from these weak humans? At that moment, he draws his sword and calls out to those guys, telling them to come at him and at least try their luck. The call happens, and everyone starts running toward our hero in anger, attempting their luck to hit him. One of them tries his luck but ends up being thrown backward, with the staff he was holding breaking in half. 2 others, who were behind, widen their eyes in surprise. Another ends up being grabbed by the head and then thrown to the ground, easily defeated. After defeating those two, the others behind become somewhat irritated. At that moment, he draws his sword and heads toward the group of extras. With the CTE in hand, he slices through and takes down the two extras in front of him. After defeating those two, we see the girl behind, taking down some of the extras. Meanwhile, another who was lying on the ground begs for a chance, saying he wasn't ready to die yet. After defeating some extras, she asks not to underestimate strong hunters. But after saying such a thing, we then see that the hunter in front of her is angry to see them mocking him. He demands they throw it, and then a blank is thrown to the ground. Minutes later, everyone wonders what's happening. On the ground, there's blood. At that moment, our protagonist realizes that this isn't good, and these guys shouldn't be messing around with this. Ahead, mini dinosaurs appear, advancing towards the group. Some of the extras who stayed behind end up being caught. Some of them might basically serve as food for those dinosaurs. While our protagonist is dealing with this, one extra isn't worth a dime. He prepares himself, but asks her to be careful because the monster in front of them is also very dangerous. She would be totally fine, but she needed to do one thing: cut everything in front of her. While he was talking about this, 3 or 5 people fell from the sky. As they fell, we saw them pointing in another direction, a direction leading to another more powerful monster that now appeared in the area. This guy gets irritated because this beast appeared right here, ruining his plans. At this moment, the more powerful dinosaur starts taking down the extras nearby. The monsters placed there to defeat our protagonist are simply thrown backward. But guess what? One of these monsters grabs the girl. To keep her from being caught, our protagonist jumps on top of her, pushing her aside. Now, after all that happened, he ends up calling the central command, saying the strongest monster has just appeared. Thus, he requests Blask's help and wonders what plan he will use to defeat this monster. Then, it is mentioned that they must use Plan R. She repeats it, saying that if he wanted to destroy everything, they would need to use the Heartbreaker. Then, she shows a suitcase, and inside it, there's something that made the protagonist then widened his eyes as he came face to face with the Heartbreak weapon. This was a weapon imbued with the power of the dragon, created from the dragon's sword scales. Unlike the game, this was essentially the very first thing created, leaving our protagonist completely thrilled. The girl then told him that, although he might not realize it, he would be the first person to use this thing, as he could transform into a dragon. This made it essentially perfect for him. However, she warned him that he could use it as much as he wanted, but the burden was immense. Still, there was a catch. If he failed to properly harness its power, his necklace would explode. In the end, synchronization was completed, and he could now use the power whenever he wanted. Yet our hero questioned whether this thing was truly safe. The voice on the other side replied that it wasn't entirely safe. The girl by his side, Marar, called out to him, urging him to be careful. Looking ahead, they saw a monster appear in front of them, ready to bite the protagonist. But he assured her he was fine. However, the girl on the other side noticed he hadn't used the power yet and suspected he might be afraid. He reiterated that he was fine. Minutes later, he began to use the power, and energy started emanating from him. What was needed now was to wait for the artifact to synchronize. Once it did, he began transforming into a dragon. Dragon-like skin appeared on him, and moments later, he was fully transformed. The protagonist then charged at high speed toward the dinosaur standing before him. Upon getting closer than ever, he struck a direct blow to its neck, launching the creature upward. After doing so, his necklace cracked and revealed its weak point. The protagonist only needed to attack it. Moments later, he delivered a punch so powerful that the dinosaur was thrown backward, landing behind the bus where the extras had been. The dinosaur was unconscious, possibly dead. Afterward, the protagonist landed on the ground, reverting from his dragon transformation. The girl approached him and asked if he was okay. He replied that he was totally beaten up, but otherwise fine. The girl insisted he needed to stay alive, as there were still people nearby. Meanwhile, in another location, one of the extras crawled out of the bus, completely battered. Looking ahead, he saw his allies completely defeated. He blamed the two for his plans failing entirely. However, the girl said it was really his own fault. Still, he demanded silence, asserting that he was a Bador, a high-ranking fighter with a level of 10 or more. Despite his state, his companion could no longer do anything. The Bador then advanced and tried to land a punch, but the protagonist stepped in, taking the hit to his face. At first, the Bador felt triumphant, but then he screamed in pain. The girl looked at his hand and saw it was completely broken. The situation left them puzzled. How could a level 10 fighter lose to a mere extra? What they didn't know was that the protagonist hadn't revealed his level yet. He then asked Blask to show them his level, and it turned out Masaki had the highest level recorded, reaching level 30. Grabbing the Bador by the collar, the protagonist couldn't believe it. The Bador thought it was impossible. He had always believed himself to be the strongest. How had the protagonist reached such a level in just 1 month? However, the protagonist pointed out that a person's level doesn't determine everything, and that he needed to fix his attitude. Then, the protagonist punched the Bador square in the face, launching him backward. With the obstacle removed, they could move forward. They were now near Tibia Park. In the game, the protagonist had never reached this part, which was essentially the lair of the Yellow Dragon. In the game, this dragon was the first boss to appear. It was extremely powerful, with lightning abilities, but its predictable patterns made it easier to defeat with practice. However, in this case, its powers disrupted the communication the group was having, causing significant interference. This made it a high-priority target that needed to be eliminated at all costs. The responsibility fell heavily on the protagonist. Fleeing was no longer an option, as it was already too late. He then heard a roar, and at that moment they then asked to be on alert because danger was approaching. But before he could do anything, he ended up jumping forward because at that very moment we observed the dragon attacking and hitting them. However, after jumping forward, he looked back, and in that beautiful moment, he found the Yellow Dragon using its powers to knock down anyone in its path. But now that he was face to face with it, he wondered where this monster came from. Before he could get an answer, the monster prepared a lightning attack aimed at him. To avoid being hit, of course, he jumped back, but even that wasn't enough. It almost hit him. However, it missed. Now that he was completely safe, we observed the girl asking if he was okay. Safe now and alive, she wondered where this monster came from. Looking up, she understood where it came from, but then realized the dragon had disappeared. In the game, it didn't use invisibility. This was too overpowered. Meanwhile, on the other side, the girl analyzed the whole situation. After analyzing, she realized that this dragon had a new ability, an ability it didn't have in the game. Things got worse if anything happened to them. In the meantime, we observed them dodging the attacks. Meanwhile, our protagonist asked her if she was okay. She, on the other hand, said she was, as attacks came from entirely different directions. At that moment, the dragon appeared in front of Aki. After appearing before her, it spread its wings to catch her. However, unable to dodge or do anything, the dragon managed to pierce her. She only closed her eyes, while elsewhere our hero called for Aki. Meanwhile, our protagonist approached, but as he got closer, she asked him to survive. Before he could do anything, he called for Blask and began to ask about Aki's condition. The system then said that Aki's situation was critical and required special treatment. But before anything could be done, the system notified them that heavy materials were approaching and told them to flee. So, they did, as the materials fell behind them. This dragon's new ability was surprising, as it used invisibility while also employing materials like steel and others to its advantage to defeat any opponent. At this moment, he no longer cared. But one thing was certain, he would deal with this monster eventually. However, he had to leave it for later because at that moment, he was surrounded. Once surrounded, the dragon launched a lightning strike, causing an explosion. After that, the dragon reappeared. Upon reappearing, we observed him clueless and without an escape plan. Looking to the side, we then saw Aki waking up. She said she didn't want to be alone and didn't want to die. Since she didn't want to die as a mother, at this moment, she recalled her sister. But then, once again, he realized the same thing was happening. He had become useless because in the end, when he needed his power, he couldn't use it. He couldn't fight. But there was something that could fight for him, the dragon. The dragon spoke sentimentally, saying that if he were willing to let another person he loved die again, then so be it. After saying this, we observed him picking up the thing he had received from that organization. Then he thought about placing Kido in it, but the device warned him not to do so, as his life would be at risk if he did. Initially, he thought about not doing it, but if he didn't, his companions, and the one he cared for, would ultimately die. So, what was the point? Thus, he ended up deciding to go ahead and, in the end, transformed into the previous dragon. Now holding the sword, he disappeared. After disappearing, he reappeared in front of this dragon, which then used its weights. The steel were basically moving towards our protagonist. But this did nothing because with just one movement, our hero managed to break part of the steel. After noticing that the dragon disappeared, he became sad. But minutes later, the dragon appeared right behind our hero, launching an energy breath towards him. However, to avoid it, he jumped back. And as expected, this monster always attacks from behind, just like in the game. But after managing to dodge, he grabbed his sword and was finally able to cut the dragon, which had been invisible. Now that he had finally cut it, he realized that its patterns were very easy to figure out. Once you discover its patterns, you can easily defeat such a monster. However, he still hadn't completely taken down the dragon, as when he looked up, he saw it disappearing. But now, it was different. He saw that the bastard was running, and this was something he didn't want to let escape. So, he ran towards the dragon with his sword in hand, and finally, he put an end to this dragon, landing a powerful blow on it. After landing the blow, the dragon fell to the ground, and the system revealed new information about this dragon. This was the dragon that used Magneto's power, attracting various steels or metals, among other things, to use as weapons to defeat its enemies. But for the dragon, it no longer mattered. It was its end. It just needed to be defeated and handed over to our protagonist in the end. However, the creature was still persistent, continuing to use its powers against our hero. But now, things were getting more serious because the dragon started to flee. He even thought about chasing the monster, but it didn't matter anymore since the girl behind him was already in her final state and was clearly about to die. He decided to go back. However, when he returned, the girl on the other side screamed at our protagonist, telling him to chase the dragon. The dragon was wounded, and she was wondering what he was doing or thinking. At that moment, he punched a piece of steel next to him and just asked her to hurry up and help, as his goal was not to chase the dragon for now, but to heal her first. After that, our protagonist would probably focus on finding the dragon again and killing it. But before he could do anything, the girl said that the collar would explode, but our protagonist no longer cared. He even told her to go ahead and activate the collar because, whether she liked it or not, that dragon in front of him was fleeing, but he would keep hunting it until the end, dying or not. Meanwhile, somewhere else, we see our hero running after the dragon. He eventually finds it, but once he does, we see that the dragon is preparing to attack him. As it prepares, it starts coming towards him. In the game, when his HP reaches a critical level, this monster uses its final attack, but perhaps this time, things could be different. However, something begins to happen. The steel pieces at the top of the building start lifting, which surprises our protagonist. After that thing lifts, he asks what's happening, but at that moment, we see a bright light appear at the top of the structure. The clock also warns that the danger there is too high, as a large magnetic beam is being formed in that thing. After the thing is formed, something escapes and flies towards our protagonist. It was so fast that it formed lightning around it, almost hitting him, but he managed to dodge the attack in the end. After that, he was surprised by the dragon's attack power, as the speed and attack power of this thing were comparable to a tank. But he didn't have much time to stand still, so he started moving toward the dragon to try something. As he advanced, we see the clock, saying that what he was trying to do was pretty stupid. Then the system advises our protagonist to retreat immediately, but he tells it to shut up. Just as he thinks about doing something, that monster starts attacking him with multiple lightning bolts, but he manages to dodge each of them while advancing. As he dodged and advanced, the system kept urging him to retreat since everything was dangerous, but our protagonist only thought that this thing would not shut up. However, while thinking about that, one of the attacks headed in his direction. Distracted by the clock, our protagonist was grazed by one of the strikes. Even though this thing was part of the group that only hindered him, he needed its help because he had a good strategy to win. But the system, on the other hand, ended up somewhat implying that it was unwilling. Yet, our protagonist persisted, arguing that his request was selfish but good in its own way. We then saw the system planning a route for him to achieve his goal. It eventually said that in 10 seconds he could run straight ahead, and then he could jump forward and later turn to the right. He then started running, and the dragon began noticing this strange movement but continued attacking him. While advancing, our protagonist finally managed to see the pillar of the tower. At the top of the tower, he only needed to do one thing: run as fast as he could. And so he did. Upon reaching the base of the tower, he began climbing it in a very peculiar way. Even the system found this way of running and escaping from the monster strange. Yet it just thanked him. In the end, Masaki almost reached the top of the tower. But this was not yet the place he needed to reach. Looking to the side, he noticed the havoc that was occurring, but there was still something beside him that kept annoying him. This thing was the dragon. At that moment, the dragon began charging energy in his direction, attempting to hit our hero. The dragon's breath was detected, and though this dragon in front of him was severely injured, he couldn't do anything yet because he had the perfect strategy to defeat the dragon. Meanwhile, he just waited, wondering if the dragon would do anything. Then it did, launching that breath towards our hero. However, our protagonist dodged it by jumping upward. In the end, after jumping up, he finally managed to do what he had been planning for so long. Masaki, at last, managed to hit the dragon directly. But it wasn't over yet. He began delivering several blows to try to bring the dragon down once and for all. It still wasn't enough. So he tightly hugged the dragon, preventing it from flying anymore and causing it to crash to the ground, utterly defeated. After defeating it, he obtained the dragon's scale. He then finished the dragon to acquire another item. This item would allow him to level up, but it could also be used to heal a certain person. But who would that person be? This person could be someone close to our hero or not, but now we have this item in hand. Perhaps we will only find out everything in the next part.